When my son passed away, my daughter-in-law said, "Nobody cares about you now, Sant." So I played the video. Have you ever stood in the middle of a house you once built with your own hands, only to realize no one sees you anymore? I made every meal, folded every blanket, sat beside my dying son while the others walked away. But the week he passed, my daughter-in-law looked me in the eye and said, "Nobody cares about you now." And for a second, I believed her. Until I opened the video. Until I saw my son, my Arthur, speaking from the other side of the grave. He looked into that camera and gave me something no one else would. Proof that I mattered. My name is Gerda Pennington. I'm 73 years old. This story begins in a quiet Vermont town just after Thanksgiving. My son was dying upstairs, and I was still folding laundry, still cooking dinner, still reading bedtime stories to his kids. Then one evening, I noticed something simple, something devastating. At the dinner table, there were only 2 plates. Mine was gone. No one said a word. But I knew. I was no longer part of the family picture. What followed wasn't just heartbreak. It was an exile. This is how it began. I cooked 3 meals a day for this family, but after the funeral, Lydia stopped setting out a 3rd plate. Mine. I'd spent the day folding laundry with fingers that couldn't quite grip the shirts like they used to, and the ache in my lower back had settled into something permanent. When I came downstairs, the kitchen smelled like thawed turkey reheated in the oven, and 2 plates were on the table, one for Walter, one for Maisie. Lydia stood at the counter, sipping wine. There was no 3rd. I didn't ask. I simply reached into the cabinet, pulled down my plate, and sat where I always had. Far end of the table, back to the window. The children didn't notice. They were too busy arguing about cranberry sauce. Lydia didn't look at me once during the meal. 2 days had passed since the funeral. Kettlebrook was quiet, as always this time of year. Lights flickered along Main Street, red and green garland around the lampposts, but the snow had come early, hard and fast, and the sidewalks were mostly empty. People waved from across the street now, bundled tight with gloved hands. No time to stop and talk when the air stung your teeth. I've lived here for 40 years. Taught Sunday school in the basement of First Presbyterian. I volunteered at the library, ran cakewalks for the PTA. And yet, as I stood in line at the pharmacy that morning, the girl behind the counter didn't recognize me. She smiled, handed me Arthur's medications, and said, "Take care of your husband." I didn't correct her. I just nodded and left $1 in the tip jar. Arthur had always told me not to tip at pharmacies. "It's not a coffee shop," he used to say, shaking his head. "They're just doing their job." But I tipped anyway. It felt like the only gesture I still had control over. At home, the attic bedroom felt colder than usual. I wrapped the heating pad around my knees and watched the light from the street lamps ripple against the frost on the window pane. Somewhere below, Lydia was vacuuming, or maybe just dragging something across the floor. She always made more noise than necessary. Arthur was still hanging on. Each breath sounded like it had to be wrestled out of him. I helped him shave that morning, or tried to. The razor slipped in my hand. He smiled through the nick on his chin and said, "You're not as steady as you used to be, Ma." I laughed, but my eyes burned. We didn't talk much anymore. He didn't have the energy. Still, when I leaned in to tuck the blanket under his chin, he whispered, "Thank you for staying." I didn't tell him that Lydia had started making space in the linen closet, that she'd packed up the guest towels and moved my shoes to the garage, that she'd said, just yesterday, without looking me in the eye, "You've done enough, Mom." No, I didn't tell him that. Walter asked for me at bedtime that night. I heard him through the vent above my bed. "Can Grandma read?" he said. Lydia answered with a sharp whisper I couldn't make out. Then Maisie's smaller voice piped up. "She always reads The Mitten." I waited, but no one called for me. I sat in the attic and stared at the trunk near the wall, the one Arthur had insisted I bring up here after we cleared his law school apartment. I hadn't opened it in years. There were things in there I didn't want to remember. Books, photos, maybe old notebooks. I didn't know. That night, Lydia came to the attic. She didn't knock. "You can't stay here forever," she said flatly. "Arthur wouldn't want you clinging to this house like a ghost. You should start packing." I didn't answer Lydia. I just nodded. That was easier than saying anything real. After she left, I stayed sitting on the edge of the bed. The old quilt beneath me had begun to thin in the middle, threadbare in patches where Arthur used to sleep when he was little. I'd kept it through every move, from the old townhouse near Montpelier to the ranch-style place we'd rented before this one. This house was never mine. It was Arthur's, bought with the first bonus he got from the firm. He called it an investment in the kids. But I knew he meant Lydia. He wanted her to feel rooted. She never did. Back then, I'd only planned to stay a few months, just to help with Walter, then a newborn. Then Maisie came. Then the cancer. You don't leave when your child's sick, even if he's 42. I went downstairs the next morning before anyone else. The coffee pot had been left full overnight, so I poured it cold into a saucepan and warmed it on the stove like we used to in the 80s. The toast was quiet, just the sound of butter hitting heat. I scrambled 2 eggs, then 3. Then I stopped myself before the 4th. 3 plates, always 3, even if only 2 were laid. When the kids came bounding in, I smiled. I always did. Walter sat with his chin in his palm, eyes still puffy from sleep. Maisie showed me her hand. She'd gotten a splinter from the banister. "Come here," I said gently. She climbed onto my lap, and I held her tiny finger up to the light, inspecting the reddened skin. I didn't have the dexterity I once did, but with a pair of tweezers and a little patience, I got it out. She kissed my cheek when I was done and whispered, "Don't tell Mommy. She said she doesn't have time this week." I didn't reply. Later that day, I walked to the corner store for milk. The sidewalks were salted, the sky low and gray. Just past the post office, I saw her, Bonnie Kimball. She was loading groceries into the back of her Subaru, a floral scarf tied over her ears. We hadn't spoken in years, not since I stopped going to church regularly. But when she looked up and saw me, she gave a small nod. Not a smile, just a nod. The kind that says, "I see you. I remember." I nodded back. Arthur was sleeping when I returned. The house was quiet. I ironed the children's school uniforms and folded Lydia's laundry, though she hadn't asked. My hands were slower now, the joints stiff. Each sleeve took longer. I thought about the holiday cards that would arrive soon. The ones with happy families posing in matching pajamas. We hadn't taken a family photo since Arthur got sick. I wasn't sure Lydia would send one at all. That evening, Lydia came home with a new coat. It still had the tag on it. $200, Nordstrom. I didn't comment. I just stirred the stew and stepped aside so she could reach the fridge. Arthur came downstairs for dinner that night. He looked like a shadow of himself, thinner than ever. Still, he kissed the kids' heads and sat at the table without complaint. I ladled the soup. There were 3 bowls, but, again, only 2 places were set. I placed mine quietly and sat down last. Halfway through the meal, Lydia put down her spoon. "You've done enough, Mom." It was so sudden. The air shifted. "You've been helpful," she added, almost as an afterthought. "But we're trying to establish a new routine, a different rhythm, for the kids." Arthur didn't say a word. He looked down at his bowl like it might offer him an exit. I wanted to scream, to ask, what new rhythm? What is the difference? I'd raised Arthur with fewer resources than she could imagine. I'd worked double shifts at the diner and still got him to school with ironed pants. I'd sewn costumes by hand. And now, I wasn't even worth a place setting. But I said nothing, just nodded again. Later, I cleared the table. 2 bowls in the dishwasher. 1 I scrubbed by hand. Mine. I stayed up late that night. The house quieted in stages. First the dishwasher, then the creaking of Lydia's bedroom door, then the faint clicks of Arthur's oxygen monitor upstairs. The attic was cold again. The little space heater I kept near the dresser buzzed, but it couldn't reach my feet. I wrapped my legs in a second blanket, but my hands, gnarled and dry, stayed cold no matter what I did. Outside, snow started falling again. Not the heavy kind, just soft flakes swirling in the yellow streetlight that leaked in through the window. For a while, I just watched. Thought about Vermont winters past. Arthur as a boy, sledding down the backyard hill, face pink with cold and laughter. His father built a snowman that leaned to one side and collapsed by morning. We had such simple joy. And now, everything in this house is complicated. At around 10, I heard Lydia on the phone. Her voice carried through the floorboards if she stood in the kitchen. And she often did, forgetting I was just a staircase away. Once he's gone, she said. She needs to go too. She paused. I imagined whoever was on the other end saying something agreeable. No, I'm serious, Lydia said, sharper now. She's clinging. It's not healthy for the kids. Or for me. Another pause. She's not even their real parent. I mean, I get it. She helped. But come on, I need to move forward. That one cut deep. Not even their real parents. I changed their diapers, taught them to tie their shoes, sang lullabies when they had ear infections, and now I was being discussed like a piece of furniture that no longer matched the decor. I sat still until the conversation ended. Then I stood, slowly. My knees cracked, and the cold floorboard groaned beneath me. I walked to the trunk in the corner, the one Arthur had never wanted to throw out. It was heavier than I remembered. I undid the latch. Dust puffed into the air. The smell of cardboard and old paper filled my nose. Inside were law books, some binders, and a few photos. A tie he'd worn to graduation. Beneath them, a plain white envelope. My name on the front. In Arthur's handwriting, it said, "To Mom. Open only when I'm gone." My hand trembled. I didn't open it. Not yet. I just stared at it. Because the moment I touched that envelope, I knew nothing in this house would ever feel the same again. Lydia's words, "Nobody cares about you now," hit me like a physical blow, stripping away every illusion of warmth. But even as I packed my life into 2 small bags, a secret message from Arthur waited, ready to ignite a battle I never expected to fight. It was barely a week after the funeral when Lydia delivered her verdict. I was wiping the edge of the stove, a habit so deep in my bones I wasn't even aware I'd begun. The familiar motion of cleaning, of keeping things in order, was a small comfort in the chaos of my grief. She stood at the sink, drying a wine glass with a towel she didn't care to wash properly, leaving streaks against the polished surface. Her back was to me, her posture stiff, almost brittle. Her voice came out even, almost bored, like she was noting the weather, completely devoid of any emotion that might betray her true feelings. "Nobody cares about you now." I paused, my hand frozen on the cool metal of the stovetop. For a moment, I actually thought she'd been talking on the phone, perhaps a private conversation I'd accidentally overheard. But there was no phone, Just me, her, and the slow, indifferent hum of the fridge behind us. The silence that followed was deafening, amplified by the casual cruelty of her words. I straightened up slowly, careful not to wince in front of her, not to give her the satisfaction of seeing my pain. She still hadn't turned around. "I need to reclaim this house," she added, as if that made it cleaner, as if her desire to erase me from this home was a practical matter, like spring cleaning. "You've had your time." She walked out before I could speak. Not that I would have. My throat had tightened, a knot of shock and disbelief. I didn't cry. I didn't yell. I just stood there, letting the last of the warmth from the oven drift over my fingers, a fading echo of the comfort I'd once provided in this kitchen. Then, with hands that felt strangely detached from my body, I dried them, climbed the attic stairs, and sat heavily on the edge of the bed. The envelope still lay beside the trunk, untouched since the night I'd found it. It was time. I picked it up, my fingers tracing the familiar contours of Arthur's handwriting. Carefully, I peeled open the seal, the paper rustling softly like a whispered secret. Inside, there was indeed a legal letter, typed, formal, and signed in crisp blue ink by Arthur and someone named Constance May Esquire. My eyes scanned the legalese, paragraphs about wills and executors and clauses, a language designed to be impenetrable to the uninitiated. But the second item caught my attention more profoundly. A small, unassuming thumb drive wrapped in a narrow red ribbon, the kind you might find on a Christmas ornament. Arthur's handwriting on a tiny tag attached to the ribbon read, "Play when you're ready." I wasn't ready. Not yet. Not for whatever final message my son had left for me. Instead, compelled by a strange mixture of dread and a practical need to just do something, I began packing. The process was slow, methodical. I didn't own much, not really. Most of what I had brought to this house over the years, my clothes, my books, my personal mementos, had gradually migrated to the attic, relegated to a space out of sight, out of mind. A few worn sweaters, an old sewing kit with tangled threads, framed photos of Arthur when he still wore braces and football cleats, a shy, gangly teenager. I folded each item gently, like it could break, each piece a fragile memory. The weight of all those years, all that quiet service pressed down on me. I realized how little space I occupied, physically and metaphorically, in this house, in their lives. I left the house the next morning, my 2 small bags all I had left. Lydia didn't offer to help. She didn't ask if I had somewhere to go. She simply stood at the open door, watching me with an expressionless gaze, a silent dismissal. Walter peeked from the stair railing, his small face etched with confusion. "Where's Grandma going?" he whispered, his voice thin and hopeful. No one answered him. Lydia remained silent, and I, unable to betray my pain or his innocent question, simply kept walking. As I passed his room, the door was slightly ajar. I glanced inside, and my heart clenched. In the corner, next to his toy box, sat a small chair with my knitting basket, a plastic cup with a tea bag still inside from our last tea party, and most poignantly, his drawing, a crayon portrait of me in a rocking chair, labeled in his childish scrawl, "Grandma's Corner." A powerful urge to turn back, to sweep him into my arms and tell him I wasn't going anywhere, almost overwhelmed me. But instead, I stepped away, forcing myself to move forward, without touching it, without looking back. Bonnie Kimball's house was 4 blocks away, off Maple Lane, a familiar path I hadn't walked in years. The bushes outside were still overgrown, a wild tangle of thorny branches, and the porch still leaned distinctly to the right, just as it had for decades. But the curtains were open, a welcoming splash of color, and the faint, comforting smell of cinnamon drifted from the front window, a promise of warmth within. She answered the door in her faded slippers and a fleece vest zipped up to her neck, her gray hair pulled back in a loose bun. "Gerda," she said, her voice surprisingly soft, saying my name like a simple fact. Not warm, not cold, just true. It was a stark contrast to Lydia's clipped tones, and it was disarmingly comforting. I stood there holding my 2 bags, my coat buttoned up to my throat against the sharp morning air. She looked me up and down, taking in my disheveled appearance, my tired eyes, and the quiet despair I knew must be radiating from me. "Come on in," she said, her voice gruff but kind. "Don't just stand there catching a chill." I stepped inside. The air was dry and smelled of old carpet and pine sol, a familiar scent of practical living. Her living room hadn't changed since 1998. Crocheted pillows adorned a faded sofa. A vintage TV set with a rabbit ear antenna occupied a corner, and a framed photo of her late husband, Vernon, perched on the mantel, looking stern and comforting at once. The cot in the corner, clearly prepared for me, had a knitted afghan folded neatly on top. "I only got 1 bathroom," she said, gesturing vaguely down the hall. "You'll share with the cat." "I'm grateful," I managed, my voice a little rough from disuse. She shrugged, a small, dismissive gesture. "Don't get sentimental. It makes tea taste bitter." We didn't speak much that afternoon. She brought me a cup anyway, lukewarm chamomile, smelling faintly of dried flowers, and left me to sit on the edge of the cot. I didn't unpack. My bags remained by the door, symbols of my transience. I just held the mug, letting its gentle warmth seep into my palms, and stared at the thumb drive resting in my lap. The tiny red ribbon was slightly wrinkled, probably tied weeks ago, an act of foresight from my son that still felt utterly surreal. By nightfall, I couldn't wait anymore. The unanswered questions, the uncertainty of my future, the aching silence of the house, it all pressed in on me. I walked to the small desk in the corner, powered up Bonnie's old laptop. It wheezed to life with a familiar mechanical groan, its screen flickering erratically before settling into a dull glow. I inserted the drive, my heart thumping a nervous rhythm against my ribs, and waited. The screen flickered again, and then Arthur's face, alive, healthy, no tubes, no shadows under his eyes, no gauntness. He was sitting in his law office, the familiar leather chair behind him, a window overlooking the quiet Kettlebrook Street. His navy tie was knotted perfectly, his hair combed back just like he used to before court. He looked vibrant, strong, utterly unlike the frail man I'd watched waste away. My breath caught in my throat. "If you're watching this," he began, his voice clear and resonant, filling the quiet room, "I'm probably gone, and I need you to know. You were never a burden." The steam from my tea curled into the morning air like a slow breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding for years. Bonnie sat across from me, nursing her own mug, her eyes flicking between the laptop screen and my face like she didn't know where to rest them. Marvin, her old orange tabby, had leapt into my lap the moment I sat down, settling into a purring ball of warmth. He curled there like he belonged. Maybe he did. Arthur's voice came steady through the speakers. It didn't crack like I thought it might. He sounded tired. Yes, cancer will do that. But his words were clear, firm, unwavering. "Mom," he said, his eyes filled with a tenderness that brought tears to mine. "You carried all the weight I never saw. You were always there, always doing, always sacrificing. And I know now that silence wasn't peace. It was a sacrifice." Bonnie didn't speak. She just pushed the sugar bowl toward me without looking, a small, knowing gesture of empathy. I'm not making this to stir up trouble, Arthur continued, his expression serious. But I've made a few things right, as best I could. If you're watching this, it means my policy has been triggered. There's $50,000 set aside from the life insurance, designated directly to you. That's not charity, Mom. That's justice for everything you gave. My breath caught again, a sharp gasp. $50,000. It wasn't about the money, not really. It was the acknowledgement, the validation. Arthur paused on the screen, looking off for a second, like he needed to find his next sentence in the space just behind the camera. Then he looked back at me, his eyes clearer than they'd been in months, filled with a profound love. I also named you temporary legal guardian for Walter and Maisie, in the event Lydia proves unfit, not because I think you'd take them away from their mother, but because someone needs to look after them with more than just structure. They need home, Mom, and you've always been home. I gripped Marvin a little tighter, my fingers tangling in his soft fur. He didn't flinch. He just purred louder, a rumbling engine of comfort. Arthur let out a long breath, the kind that used to make his ribs shift beneath the hospice sheets. This isn't revenge, he whispered, his voice a little hoarser now, but no less resolute. It's a safeguard. For them. For you. At minute 5, his voice wavered slightly, a hint of the strain that was to come. He pressed his fingers together, a familiar gesture, like he was bracing for something bigger than death itself. Please, he whispered, his eyes locking with mine through the screen, an almost pleading look. Don't fade away after I'm gone. And I didn't realize I was crying until I felt Bonnie slide a napkin into my hand, her touch surprisingly gentle. The tears fell, silent and steady, a lifetime of unspoken burdens finally washing away. The video ended quietly. No music, no fade out. Just the click of a file closing and the soft hum of Bonnie's heater behind us. Bonnie finally spoke, her voice low, rough around the edges, breaking the spell. Well, that was something. I didn't trust my own voice enough to answer. I just nodded, wiped my eyes, and reached for the tea I'd let go cold. Bonnie, without a word, poured me a fresh cup, its warmth a silent affirmation. The thumb drive lay on the desk between us, a small, powerful artifact. I reached over, picked it up, and carefully wrapped the red ribbon back around it, tighter this time. This wasn't over. This was just the beginning. The world saw me as invisible, but Arthur had looked straight into the camera and made me real again. Armed with his final, defiant truth, I walked into the lawyer's office, knowing the quiet grandmother they knew was gone. And a new fight was just beginning. The next morning, I dressed with more care than usual. Not because I wanted to impress anyone. Those days were long gone. But because something about walking into a lawyer's office made me want to feel assembled. Like I hadn't been picked apart piece by piece over the last few weeks. I chose my good wool skirt, a sensible navy blouse, and the low, comfortable heels Arthur had bought me for my 71st birthday. Each button, each clasp, felt like a deliberate act of putting myself back together. My reflection in the foggy bathroom mirror was still that of an old woman, but today, there was a glint in her eye, a quiet resolve that hadn't been there in months. Bonnie drove me in her old Ford. The heater barely worked, and the defroster made a noise like a tired dog groaning. But we made it. Downtown Kettlebrook was already dressed for Christmas. Wreaths on every lamppost, fake snow in storefronts, a giant nutcracker outside the pharmacy. I barely noticed any of it. My gaze was fixed on the soft blue sign above the office door. Rhodes and May, attorneys at law. It felt like the gateway to a different kind of world, one where words held weight and intentions mattered. The receptionist greeted me with a smile that felt genuine, not the practiced cheer of a sales clerk. She offered me a candy cane from a crystal bowl. I took it out of politeness, the red and white stripes feeling incongruous in my gloved hand. I didn't unwrap it. The quiet hum of the office, the scent of coffee and old paper, all contributed to a feeling of solemnity, a sense that something important was about to happen. Quincy Rhodes was younger than I expected, late 40s maybe, African American, with calm, intelligent eyes, and a warm tone in his voice that immediately put me at ease. His handshake was firm, not a power move, just human. It was a relief. I'd anticipated a stiff, unfeeling man in a suit, eager to dismiss an old woman. Instead, I found a man who looked like he genuinely listened. "Mrs. Pennington," he said, gesturing to a comfortable-looking leather chair across from his polished wooden desk. "Arthur told me a lot about you." "Only the good, I hope," I said, and my voice surprised me. Not meek, not apologetic, but steady. A small victory. He smiled, a genuine crinkle around his eyes. "Only the good, and plenty of it." He spoke of your quiet strength, your unwavering presence. He always said you were the truest north on his compass. His words were a balm, a gentle counterpoint to Lydia's recent cruelties. They settled in my chest, a small, warm ember. Quincy opened a thick folder, its contents neatly organized, and slid it across to me. I didn't open it right away. The words inside already weighed on me, even unread. I knew vaguely what they would confirm, but the reality of it, committed to paper and sealed with a lawyer's authority, was different. It felt real, permanent. I wanted to confirm. Everything Arthur recorded was notarized, signed, and filed, Quincy said, his voice low and professional. The insurance disbursement is clean, and the guardianship clause is solid. If Lydia contests, it will go through review, but Arthur was very deliberate in his wishes. He left no room for ambiguity. I nodded, still staring at the folder, the weight of it in my lap. "Did he seem angry?" I asked, finally lifting my gaze to meet his. I needed to know. I'd seen so much anger and resentment in his final months, twisted by illness, and I worried he'd carried that into his last acts. "No," Quincy said softly, his voice full of compassion. "He was steady, intentional. He didn't want to hurt anyone, Mrs. Pennington. He wanted to protect you. He wanted to ensure that you, and more importantly, his children, would be taken care of. He spent a lot of time thinking about this, ensuring every detail was accounted for, every what-if addressed." That last sentence broke something open in me. After years of doing the protecting, of being the steadfast, quiet force, the idea that someone, my own son, had drawn a line in the sand for me felt utterly foreign. It was like someone had slipped a heavy, warm coat over my shoulders after decades spent shivering in the cold. A shiver, not of chill, but of profound relief, ran down my spine. Quincy slid a sealed letter across the desk. The paper was thick, cream-colored, and the recipient's name, Lydia, was written in Arthur's familiar, clear hand. Not a single flourish. It was direct, purposeful. "He wanted you to give this to Lydia, yourself," Quincy explained, his gaze steady, searching my reaction. I looked at the envelope. This wasn't a casual note. It was a final message, delivered from beyond the grave. The thought of handing it to Lydia, of seeing her reaction, was daunting, but also undeniably necessary. I tucked it into my coat pocket without a word, the crisp edge of the envelope pressing against my ribs like a silent promise. Quincy leaned back in his chair, a slight smile playing on his lips. If you'd like me to arrange a meeting, I can be present, mediate the discussion. I'll handle it, I said, cutting him off gently. Not sharp, not defiant, but simply decided. This was my battle to fight, my truth to deliver. No one else could do it for me. He nodded, understanding in his eyes. You know, when Arthur came in to sign all this, a few weeks before he passed, Quincy continued, his voice softening. He told me, my mother taught me what love feels like in silence. I want to return the favor out loud. His words hung in the air, a testament to the bond Arthur and I shared, a bond that transcended Lydia's resentment, even death itself. I didn't cry. Not then. There was no time for it. Only movement. Only the next step. By the time I stepped outside, the wind had picked up, whipping through the narrow streets of Kettlebrook. It was cold enough to make my joints protest, a familiar ache. But I stood a little taller walking back to Bonnie's car. My coat didn't feel so heavy anymore, no longer burdened by invisible expectations. It felt like armor. That afternoon, I didn't sit still. The familiar urge to busy my hands took over, but this time, it was driven by purpose, not avoidance. I ironed my best coat again, smoothing out imaginary wrinkles. I polished my shoes until the light from the window bounced off them like a quiet nod of approval. Bonnie watched from her worn recliner, sipping lukewarm chamomile, saying nothing, but her eyes followed every motion I made. I could feel her silent support, a steady presence that anchored me. I rehearsed what I might say, lines about decency, about respect, about family. None of them sounded quite right when I whispered them out loud to the empty air of Bonnie's living room. They felt hollow, formal. This wasn't about etiquette. It was about laying bare a truth. I thought of Arthur's voice in the video. Calm, firm, undeniable. That was the tone I needed. Direct, unflinching. Outside, the sidewalks were rimmed with slush, and the sky had turned a hard, unyielding shade of gray. Christmas decorations blinked in windows like small, tired beacons, struggling against the fading light. The Pennington house came into view slowly, looming at the end of the street. The porch still cluttered with the kids' forgotten snow boots and last year's welcome mat, faded and curled at the edges. It looked less like a home and more like a stage set. I stood across the street for a full minute, the cold seeping through my coat, Arthur's letter in my pocket burning against my ribs. I took a deep breath, the frosty air sharp in my lungs. I didn't want revenge. I didn't even want recognition, not in the way Lydia might understand it. But I did want the truth to be spoken, even if it trembled, even if it shattered the fragile peace Lydia had built around herself. The walk up the front steps felt like marching across a courtroom. Each board creaked beneath my weight, sounding like a gavel striking. My hand reached for the doorbell, a strange mix of dread and defiance swirling within me. I rang the doorbell. Once, firmly. Through the frosted glass, I saw Lydia's shape moving. She paused, as if she knew who it was, as if she could sense the shift in the air. Then she opened the door, her lips pressed thin, eyebrows slightly raised. Annoyed, not surprised. Her expression was a mask of weary irritation, the one she wore so often these days. She didn't say hello, just, "What do you want?" Her voice was clipped, impatient. I met her gaze. My own eyes, I hoped, held the same calm certainty Arthur's had in the video. "I'd like to speak to my grandchildren," I stated, my voice steady, betraying none of the tremor in my hands. "With a lawyer present." Her mouth parted just slightly, a flicker of genuine shock crossing her face before she could suppress it. But no sound came out. The implication hung heavy in the crisp winter air between us. I didn't wait for a reply. I simply stood there, letting the cold settle in my bones like steel, an unmoving, undeniable presence. The battle had begun. She thought I'd knock to ask permission. I rang the bell to claim what was already mine. The door creaked open slower than usual, like even the hinges were reluctant. Lydia stood there in a cardigan too thin for December, one eyebrow raised as if I were a solicitor. For a second, she didn't say anything, just looked at me like a smudge on glass she'd forgotten to wipe away. "I let you in," she finally said, stepping aside. "That doesn't mean you belong here." I didn't answer, not with words. I stepped past her into the living room, the same room where I'd read Maisie her first picture book, where Walter had curled beside me under a blanket while the flu ran its course. The room looked different, not messy, but untouched, like someone had staged it to look like a home rather than actually live in it. There were half-strung lights on the tree, the top bare. A single ornament dangled from the lowest branch, a popsicle stick reindeer Maisie had made last year. It looked lonely. I sat down on the couch and pulled the envelope from my coat pocket. Arthur's handwriting faced her like a truth she hadn't invited. She hesitated before taking it. "What is this?" "From Arthur. Legal. He wanted you to read it. Personally." She opened it slowly, like the paper might burn. As her eyes moved across the page, I watched her face shift. Not break, not yet, but falter. She sat across from me, the letter trembling slightly in her hands. It didn't take long to read, but silence hung in the room afterward like a low fog. Lydia finally spoke, her voice quieter, but laced with something bitter. "So he chose you over me." I met her eyes. He chose stability. He chose love that doesn't vanish when inconvenient. Her mouth tightened. I heard small footsteps upstairs, the scuffle of socked feet on hardwood, then the unmistakable sound of the kids' voices. "Grandma?" Walter appeared first, then Maisie right behind. They blinked when they saw me, then bolted. Maisie's arms wrapped around my waist so tightly I nearly lost my balance. Walter hugged from the side, his face pressed into my coat. "Where were you?" she whispered. I didn't answer that. I just held them. Lydia stood frozen, and in that moment, the children, without a single word, delivered a truth deeper than any document Arthur had left behind. Bonnie had offered me her late husband's army parka that morning, said it was armor in wool form. It was too big in the shoulders and smelled faintly of cedar and pipe tobacco. But as I sat there with the children still wrapped around me, I understood why she'd insisted. Maisie looked up at me, cheeks pink. "Can you come back and read tonight?" Walter chimed in, hopeful. "We still have the snowman book." Lydia finally found her voice. "Kids, go wash up. Now." They hesitated. Maisie clung tighter. I gave them a soft pat on their backs. "Go on. I'll be here." After they disappeared upstairs, Lydia turned toward me, her arms crossed. "You really think this letter gives you leverage?" I didn't flinch. "It's not leverage, it's clear." She scoffed. "You manipulated him while he was dying. You made him write that." I shook my head slowly. "No, I stayed while he was dying, that's all." Silence again. Not the heavy kind from earlier, but a sharper one, like brittle glass. Later that week, we sat in Quincy Rhodes's office. He wore a sweater vest with tiny reindeer stitched near the collar and offered Lydia a candy cane she didn't take. He laid the paperwork out gently, like sacred pages. Everything here is notarized. Arthur left instructions not out of malice, but foresight. Lydia picked at a thread on her sleeve. He didn't tell me. He told me, I said, voice calm. Because he knew you wouldn't listen. Quincy didn't add fuel. He simply nodded and let the silence fill the room. He pointed to the clause. If there's documented emotional neglect or instability, Mrs. Pennington here has the right to request joint or temporary custody. Arthur's words, not mine. Lydia's face went blank for a second. Then she crossed her legs and stared out the window. So what now? You take over? Play house? I didn't answer. I didn't need to. Snow fell heavier that evening, the kind that stuck to tree branches and turned roads into quiet, glowing veins under streetlights. I stood at the bus stop near Bonnie's place, watching flakes gather on my coat sleeves. Marvin, her tabby, had tried to follow me out, but Bonnie caught him at the door and muttered, "Not tonight, soldier." I looked down at my gloved hands. They weren't shaking anymore. The next morning, I returned to the house, not with lawyers or threats, just presence. Lydia opened the door, her lips pressed into a thin line. "You can't just keep showing up." "I'm not here to argue," I said. She stepped aside without speaking. In the living room, the tree still sat undecorated. The kids weren't around. "I've scheduled appointments with a mediator," Lydia said. "This isn't up for debate." I nodded. "Good. Then let's talk openly." She rounded on me, sudden heat in her voice. "You always played the martyr. He pitied you. That's why he left all that crap. Guilt." My voice didn't rise. "No. He saw what you refused to do. That I was always here. Not perfect. Just a present." Then her voice cracked. The first real crack I'd heard in weeks. "You don't know what it's like. Raising kids alone. Watching your husband rot away while your mother-in-law waits upstairs like some ghost." I felt the urge to touch her shoulder. I didn't. "I was waiting because he asked me to stay," I said quietly. "Because he couldn't bear the thought of dying with you angry all the time." Her face flushed. She turned away. "I want you out by Christmas Eve," she said through clenched teeth. I didn't move. Then I spoke, slow, clear. "I'll leave when the children tell me they no longer need me." This one wasn't for me. It had her name on it. Lydia. Written in Arthur's shaky, stubborn handwriting. Lydia found the second envelope tucked in the back of a drawer Arthur rarely used, sealed tightly and labeled in a pen she hadn't seen since hospice. Her fingers hovered above it, breath caught between the familiar ache of missing him and the dread of what his words might reveal. She didn't open it right away. Instead, she stood in the center of her sterile bedroom, Arthur's old flannel shirt hanging loosely on her shoulders, and listened to the quiet that had filled her house like fog. Later that evening, when the house was still and even the wind outside seemed to rest, Lydia sat on the edge of her bed, locked the door behind her, and peeled back the envelope's seal. Inside was a small thumb drive, identical to the one Gerda had carried. Only this one bore her name. A deep, reluctant breath later, she plugged it into the dusty laptop she rarely touched. The screen blinked awake, and there he was. Arthur, propped up in a hospital bed, his smile faint but real. "Hi, Lydia," he began, his voice hoarse but measured. "If you're watching this, I'm probably not here anymore." She bristled at the simplicity of his tone. Not mourning, not accusing, just talking. She watched in silence, arms crossed, bracing for blame. "I know you resented how close I was to my mom," he continued. "You never said it out loud, but I saw it. In your sighs, in the way you left the room when she came in how you never called her by her name." Lydia's jaw tightened. Part of her wanted to scoff, to shut the lid and be done with it. But something in his eyes, soft, steady, made her stay. "She didn't replace you," Arthur said. "She supported us both, and I know we both let that go unacknowledged. I never meant to make you feel like second place." She blinked. Her chest felt heavier than before, like the grief she'd tried to bury had found its way back to the surface, disguised as truth. Arthur's image on the screen shifted slightly as he adjusted the blanket over his legs. Behind him, Lydia noticed a childish drawing taped to the hospital wall. Walter's, maybe. Bright, clumsy stars and crooked stick figures holding hands. "I want the kids to remember a version of you that still believes in love, Lydia," Arthur said. "Not the one who walks around bitter, always guarding herself from softness. You can be more. You are more. Just let her help." Lydia's hands shook. Not from anger, not even from guilt. Just a sudden, aching sadness she hadn't let touch her in years. Lydia sat still for a long time after the video ended. She hadn't even realized her hands had been trembling until she looked down and saw the faint ripple in her glass of water. The laptop screen had gone black, but Arthur's voice still rang in her ears, soft and firm. "Let her help." She stared at the framed drawing behind him in the video, Walter's shaky handwriting. "To Daddy." She'd forgotten that picture. It had been taped to the wall in the hospice room for weeks. Gerda was the one who'd carefully flattened the corners and retaped it every time it sagged. Lydia had rolled her eyes then. What did it matter? He was dying. Now, that same picture felt like a punch in the chest. She wiped her face with the sleeve of Arthur's old flannel. She hadn't meant to wear it. It had been at the back of her closet for months, one of the last things she couldn't bring herself to pack away. She'd told herself it was just comfortable, warm. But it wasn't about warmth. It was about him, about missing someone who'd seen through her worst and stayed anyway. The house was silent except for the faint hum of the fridge. It was too late for dinner, too early for sleep. Lydia moved on autopilot. Opened drawers, half-heartedly rearranged the dish towels, stood at the kitchen sink doing nothing. She hated this in-between feeling, like she was standing on the edge of something but didn't know which direction was safe. In the corner of the counter, the second envelope, now empty, sat like a quiet verdict. Arthur hadn't accused her. He hadn't even sounded disappointed, just hopeful, which was worse. She walked down the hall toward Walter's room and paused. His door was ajar, and inside, a soft light glowed. He was coloring, humming under his breath. "Hey, buddy," she said gently. He looked up, crayon in hand. "Hi, Mommy." She stepped in, kneeling beside him. "What are you working on?" He turned the paper toward her. It was a picture of their living room. The tree, the couch, and 3 stick figures. "It's for Christmas. That's you, me, and Grandma." Lydia's throat tightened. "You drew Grandma?" "Yeah," he pointed. "She's holding the star. You said we'd put it up soon." Lydia nodded, unable to speak. She hadn't meant it when she'd said that, days ago, just to quiet him down. She hadn't expected him to remember. "Do you want her to stay for Christmas?" she asked, quietly. Walter looked at her like it was the most obvious thing in the world. "Yeah, she always makes it feel like Christmas." Lydia blinked fast. "Okay." He tilted his head. "Can I tell her? That she come?" Lydia hesitated, then smiled. A small, tired smile. "I'll tell her." She stood and left the room, walking slowly back to her own. She picked up her phone from the nightstand. Gerda's number was still saved under Mom Pennington. Her thumb hovered over the call button. But she didn't press it. Instead, she walked out to the living room and stood near the tree. It was still bare, just lights and a skirt. No ornaments. She stared at the top, empty and waiting. When Walter came in with his drawing, she knelt beside him again. "Would you think—" she started, then cleared her throat. "What would you think if Grandma stayed for Christmas?" He grinned. "I'd love that." She kissed the top of his head. "Okay then." Bonnie had just set a fresh batch of cookies on the kitchen counter when Gerda's phone vibrated. It was a number she didn't recognize. Vermont area code. She stared at it until it stopped ringing. She didn't call back. Instead, she walked over to the window. Outside, snow blanketed Bonnie's yard, quiet and smooth, like icing on a cake no one would cut. The Christmas lights Bonnie had hung, lopsided, uneven, blinked softly against the frost. There was something comforting about their imperfection. Inside her robe pocket, Gerda's fingers found the folded paper she kept there now. Arthur's handwritten will. She didn't need to reread it. Every word had burned itself into her. Upstairs, she could hear Marvin, Bonnie's fat orange cat, jumping off something he probably shouldn't have been on. Then footsteps. Bonnie appeared in the doorway, holding 2 chipped mugs of cocoa. "I figured," Bonnie said, not explaining what she figured. Gerda took the mug. "Thanks." "She saw the video, didn't she?" Gerda nodded. Bonnie sat across from her, blowing on her drink. "I saw her at the pharmacy. Looked like a raccoon that had crawled out of a chimney. Eyes puffy, hair wild, holding a bottle of NyQuil like it was salvation." Gerda didn't laugh, but she didn't flinch either. "I almost went up to her," Bonnie continued. "But then I thought, this ain't my fight." "It's not a fight," Gerda said. "Not anymore." Bonnie raised an eyebrow. "Then what is it?" Gerda didn't have an answer. That night, just before bed, she opened her notebook. She hadn't written in it in years, but now words spilled out like floodwater. She wrote down everything Arthur had said, everything he hadn't. She wrote about the way Lydia looked at the kids like they were heavy, not holy. She wrote about the way Walter still left a space on the shelf labeled Grandma's Books. And she wrote about Maisie's lisp and how she missed hearing it mangle Christmas songs. And then she wrote one sentence alone on the page. Redemption isn't a gift, it's a choice. The next morning, the house was filled with the scent of cinnamon and burnt toast. Bonnie's toaster had a vendetta against bread. Gerda sat by the window, dressed, coat buttoned, scarf tied. She was waiting. At 8:03 a.m., her phone lit up again. Lydia. This time, she answered. There was silence at first, then a voice more frayed than sharp. Would you come for dinner, Christmas Eve?" Gerda took a breath, not out of surprise, but restraint. "Yes," she said, "but only if it's for them. Not for you. Not for me." "I know," Lydia said. "It is." Gerda hung up before the silence stretched too far. Later that day, she sat with Bonnie on the porch, wrapped in thick blankets and watching the world go white. "I thought you'd be packing," Bonnie said. "Tomorrow." Bonnie didn't press. Instead, she pulled a little box from her coat pocket and handed it over. "Something for you." Gerda opened it. Inside was a brooch. Tarnished silver, shaped like a dove. "It was my mother's," Bonnie said. "She gave it to me when I finally stood up to my ex-husband. Said it was for when women remember they have wings." Gerda blinked fast. "Bonnie?" "No fuss," Bonnie said. "Just wear it. Remind her who raised that boy she married." Gerda laughed, and it cracked something open inside her. It wasn't bitter. It wasn't triumphant. Just real. Just needed. The next morning was Christmas Eve. Gerda stood in front of the mirror, adjusting the brooch on her coat. Her hands didn't shake. She walked down the street, each footstep sure, steady, solid. The snow crunched beneath her boots like an applause no one else could hear. When she reached the Pennington house, she paused, not because she was afraid, but because she wanted to remember. She rang the bell. Walter opened the door. His eyes lit up. "Grandma!" He didn't wait for permission. He threw his arms around her waist and held on like he'd never let go. Behind him, Maisie peeked out, grinning with 2 missing teeth. "You came!" Gerda nodded. "Of course I did." Then Lydia appeared. She looked human, not small, not defeated, just unguarded. She was wearing Arthur's old flannel. "Dinner's almost ready," Lydia said, voice tight. Gerda stepped inside. No plates had been set yet. The table was bare. She looked at Lydia. "Do you want help?" Lydia didn't answer with words. She just nodded, walked into the kitchen and started pulling dishes from the cabinet. Gerda followed. Together, in silence, they set 3 plates, then 4, then 5. No one said whose place was whose. They didn't need to. There were 4 plates on the table again. Mine had a sprig of rosemary on it, and a note that just said, "Thank you." It wasn't flashy, not centered under crystal lighting, just tucked beneath the edge of my fork, almost shy. But my eyes went straight to it, like it had been glowing all along. I stood in the hallway of the Pennington home for a few seconds too long, coat still on, holding a paper bag with 2 wrapped gifts. Walter ran past me in socks that didn't match. "Grandma's here!" he yelled like I hadn't just been in this kitchen a week ago. Maisie peeked from behind the banister, hands sticky from what looked like frosting. "I made you something," she said, holding up a pine cone dripping with glitter and glue. "It's for your room." "My room," I repeated softly. Not the guest room, not Bonnie's spare cot. Just mine. Lydia was in the kitchen. She didn't rush to greet me, didn't smile right away, but she nodded once. And it didn't feel forced. She was wearing a dark green sweater, her hair tied back, and she looked tired. Not the sharp-edged kind of tired, but the kind that clings to you like a wet coat. Still, she moved with purpose, pulling out forks and pouring cider into chipped mugs like it mattered again. I hung my coat, took off my boots, and stepped into the warmth of the living room. The tree was modest, paper ornaments, a crooked star, but it glowed. The fireplace crackled low, not for show, but to keep the chill away. Walter came running back with a red bow tie clipped crooked on his collar. "It's itchy," he complained. Maisie, now holding a glue stick in one hand and a cookie in the other, beamed at me. "That's my favorite chair," she declared, pointing at the recliner. "But you can borrow it tonight." I laughed, easing into it, my knees creaking in protest. "I'll return it in perfect condition, ma'am." Lydia emerged from the kitchen and looked at the table. She hesitated for a moment, then turned to the silverware drawer. 4 plates, 4 sets of cutlery, 4 cloth napkins, not paper ones. My place setting wasn't a mistake. It wasn't an afterthought. Dinner was roasted ham, mashed potatoes, and green beans with little slivers of almonds. Everything smelled of cinnamon and butter. Lydia had cooked, not reheated, not ordered in. Cooked. We sat. No one made a toast. Walter clinked his glass against Maisie's by accident, and juice spilled on the tablecloth. Lydia didn't scold. She just wiped it clean. I unfolded the note beside my plate. No signature, just the 2 words, "Thank you." I folded it back, placed it gently into my pocket. Dinner passed with soft clinks and half-laughed memories. Walter talked about the snowman he built, named it James T. Blobby. Maisie wanted to know if reindeer really flew or if that was just a metaphor. And then, after dessert, Bonnie's cinnamon bundt cake proudly declared, "Store-bought, but don't tell the kids." The children insisted. "One story," Walter begged. Maisie nodded vigorously. The rabbit one! I looked at Lydia. She didn't speak, but she walked to the shelf and pulled out a worn, cloth-bound book. She handed it to me without comment. The Velveteen Rabbit, Arthur's favorite. I cleared my throat, opened the cover, and began. I read slowly, letting the rhythm of the words wrap around the room like a blanket. Real isn't how you are made. I read aloud. It's a thing that happens to you. Maisie curled up against my side, her head warm on my shoulder. Walter was on the rug, chin in hands, eyes steady. Lydia sat in the armchair across from us, one leg tucked beneath her, a mug of tea untouched in her lap. She wasn't smiling, but she wasn't scowling either. I remembered reading this same story to Arthur when he was small, back when he still believed in magic and bedtime had its own quiet magic too. He'd always ask if the rabbit ever missed the boy after he became real. I never knew how to answer. When I closed the book, there was a beat of silence before Maisie whispered, "That was the best one yet." Walter yawned without apology. "You should read every Christmas." "I'll try," I said, and I meant it. The kids were sent upstairs. Hugs were quick but tight. Walter, in his bow tie, gave me a thumbs up. Maisie kissed my cheek without words. I listened to their small feet thump up the stairs, their laughter echoing until the door clicked closed. I stood, stretching my knees. Lydia was still in her seat, staring into the fire like it had something to say. "I watched the whole thing," she said quietly, not looking at me. It took me a second to realize she meant the video, the one Arthur had recorded for her. "I figured you would." She hesitated, the word sticking. "I'm sorry I waited this long." The fire crackled. A log collapsed into embers. Outside, snow touched the window panes in whispering taps. I sat down beside her. "He believed in both of us, Lydia," I said. "I'm willing to try, if you are." She nodded. Her eyes glistened, but no tears fell. She didn't speak again. We didn't need to. There's a kind of silence that hurts. The kind filled with what wasn't said. But this wasn't that. This was the other kind. The kind that said enough had been spoken. Later, I climbed the stairs slowly, still unsure whether to call this place home again. But in the room where I used to sleep, not the attic, not Bonnie's cot, but my old space, I found something on the bed, a wrapped gift. The tag read only, "From Walter and Maisie." Inside was a simple apron, beige cotton, hand-stitched. Painted along the bottom hem were 4 messy handprints, 2 red, 2 green, in a circle like a wreath. I traced each one with my finger. Then I saw it, peeking from inside the folded towel beside it. A familiar envelope. Arthur's handwriting again. It had been tucked into one of the books I brought earlier. I hadn't noticed. I sat down on the edge of the bed, heart thick, hands trembling. It was addressed simply, "Mom." I unfolded the letter with slow hands, careful not to tear its worn edges. Arthur's handwriting wasn't neat anymore. The lines wobbled, like his voice had in those final weeks. But the heart was unmistakable. "Mom," it began, "if you're reading this, I hope it means you're back home. I hope the kids are asleep upstairs, full of cookies and warm stories. And I hope Lydia's finally learned how to make tea without burning the kettle." I smiled through the sting of tears. "I left this tucked in the book you used to read me every December, the one where the rabbit becomes real. I used to think that meant pain, the losing of something. But I get it now. Being loved, even once, makes everything else real too." There was a pause, a space of blank paper between paragraphs, as if he wanted me to breathe. "I know it wasn't easy being here, Lydia and I, we didn't make it easy, but you stayed. Even when you were tired, even when it hurts, even when nobody saw it. I reached for a tissue from the side table, careful not to let the letter blur. I didn't leave this for you to forgive us. The next line read, "You've done that already, 1,000 times, in ways we never deserved. I left it because I wanted you to know. I see you now. I see everything you carried." I pressed the paper to my chest, just for a moment. You are not a relic. You are not background noise. You are the thread, the spine, the quiet that held us together. My breath caught. That line. I would hold that line forever. If Lydia ever lets herself listen, really listen, she'll know it too. And if she does, I ask just one thing. Stay open. For the kids. For her. For you. There was no signature. Just one final sentence, scribbled smaller than the rest. I hoped you'd be home when you read this. I folded the letter carefully, tucked it into my cardigan pocket like a secret, like a prayer. Downstairs, the house was quiet. I could hear the soft tick of the old grandfather clock in the hallway, the faint hum of the fridge. Somewhere outside, a dog barked once, then fell silent again. I patted down to the kitchen. A second mug of cocoa sat waiting beside the sink. Marshmallows already melted into a soft swirl. Bonnie was there, unwrapping a bundt cake from its plastic box. "Store-bought," she muttered. "But don't tell the kids." I gave her a look. "I wouldn't dare." She winked, then handed me a fork. "You did good, Gerda. He'd be proud." "I hope so," I whispered. Walter and Maisie came bounding down the stairs moments later. Pajama-clad and giggling, Walter had one sock on, the other missing. Maisie had tinsel tangled in her hair. "Grandma, Grandma," they sang in unison. "You forgot dessert," I laughed. A real one, from somewhere deeper than I remembered having. Lydia appeared last, still quiet, but something in her eyes had softened, melted slightly in the glow of the tree lights. She held a wrapped package awkwardly in both hands. "I forgot to give you this," she said. "Earlier." I took it gently. The shape was strange, soft, lumpy. I peeled back the paper. An apron, not fancy, just cotton, but stitched along the bottom were the kids' handprints, now dry and colorful. I blinked back more tears than I wanted to show. "It's perfect," she nodded, swallowing hard. "Merry Christmas, Gerda." "Merry Christmas, Lydia." We stood there like that, suspended for a moment. Not quite friends, not yet, but something new, something fragile, but forming. Later that night, as the snow dusted over the rooftops and the lights glowed steady in the window, I sat by the fire alone. The kids had gone to bed. Lydia and Bonnie had cleaned the last dishes. The house was still. I held the letter again, ran my fingers over his words. "I hoped you'd be home when you read this." I was, and I was staying. There are winter nights that don't feel cold because of the snow, but because you no longer feel like you belong. I used to believe that if I gave enough, stayed quiet enough, loved hard enough, family would always be a safe place. But the truth is, if you don't learn to value yourself, even those closest to you can forget your worth. Arthur saw me when the rest of the world seemed to forget I existed. But more importantly, I learned to see myself again, with the same gentleness I gave everyone else, except me. Kindness isn't always appreciated, but self-respect should never be given away. If this story reminded you of someone who's loved quietly, maybe today's the day to say thank you. Just one word might be enough to put that fourth plate back on the table.